The wind, cold and unforgiving, swept across the barren plains of the planet Zaldrath, kicking up the ashes of what once had been a thriving colony. Now the only inhabitants of this place were the echoes of its demise, the soft, whispering remnants of forgotten glory. A single figure sat on the cracked surface, her once gleaming armor now dulled by time, battle, and the relentless passage of time. Her long, elegant ears twitched, their tips barely touching the rim of her helmet, a stark reminder of who she had once been. Her name had once been a symbol of fear across the stars, a name whispered in hushed tones by both allies and enemies alike. Queen Liethra of the Azreth Dominion, a title that had been the envy of countless empires. Now it was as obsolete as the crumbling structures around her. She stared out into the horizon, her sharp, silver-gray eyes scanning the emptiness with a detached kind of resignation. It had been hours, perhaps days. She had long since lost track, since she'd last moved. Not that there was much to do. Her empire had crumbled into dust, betrayed by those she had once trusted, and she was left here, stranded on this desolate rock, alone. At first she had thought it a cruel joke, that perhaps one of her enemies, reveling in their victory, had left her here to rot. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was nothing left to rot. No palace to return to, no armies to command, no legacy to preserve. Just this planet, this wasteland, and the slow, inevitable decay of everything she had once held dear. Her fingers twitched, clenching into fists as she thought about the betrayal. How could they have done this? How could her closest allies, her advisors, her generals, turn their backs on her when she needed them the most? The thought was maddening. She had given them everything, her trust, her loyalty, her crown. And in return, they had stolen it all from her, leaving her to die in the void. She leaned back against the shattered remains of a communication tower, its once pristine surface now jagged and cracked, much like the remnants of her rule. She had no illusions left. She was alone, and it was over. But just as the thought of death began to settle in, the faintest sound reached her ears, a low hum. At first she thought it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks. But then it grew louder, more distinct, the whine of an engine. A ship? She sat up, her heart skipping a beat. It had been so long since she had seen any sign of life. She had assumed that no one would come for her. But here, now, she could hear it. A ship, a small one by the sound of it. She couldn't tell the make or model. Spacecraft weren't her specialty. But it was definitely heading her way. The sound of the ship grew louder, and soon the ship itself appeared in the sky, its silhouette cutting a sharp line against the cloudless blue. She squinted, trying to make out the details. It was a strange vessel, smaller than the warship she had once commanded, with no visible markings, no insignia. Whoever was piloting it had either no taste for ostentation, or they were trying to remain unnoticed. It descended slowly, like an insect landing on a piece of old stone. The ground trembled beneath her feet as the ship touched down, its landing gear crunching the dry earth beneath it. A small cloud of dust and debris spiraled into the air, but the ship remained grounded, quiet now, almost as if it was waiting for something. Liethra rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. Her first instinct was to retreat, to disappear into the shadows. After all, what could a lone survivor like herself do against a ship potentially full of enemies? But curiosity, yes, curiosity, had always been one of her few weaknesses. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was the first real opportunity she had had in what felt like an eternity. Perhaps this was her chance to escape, to find some way to survive, to rise again. She stood motionless as the ship's hatch opened with a hiss. The air pressure inside clearly different from that outside. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the light. A human. She blinked, incredulous. A human? Of all the beings in the galaxy, why would a human be here? The figure straightened, adjusting something on his suit as he surveyed the surroundings. His face was partially obscured by a helmet, but she could see the faint glint of eyes peering through the visor. He didn't seem to notice her at first. His attention focused on something, likely a readout of some sort, on his wrist. She took a cautious step forward, her voice low. "I hope you have a reason for landing on my planet." The human turned toward her with an almost comical speed, as if he had been expecting someone else. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment they just stared at each other, the silence stretching between them. He took a step closer, his voice muffled by the helmet. "Uh-huh. Didn't think I'd find anyone alive out here. I was half expecting a ghost or a pile of bones." Leothra's eyebrow twitched. She didn't know whether to be offended or amused. "And what makes you think I'm a ghost?" "Well, you don't exactly look like you're in the best shape," he said, shrugging. "Not exactly a five-star destination either." She bit back a retort, her pride prickling. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you. And this is my domain. You're trespassing." The human chuckled, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through his messy brown hair. He seemed entirely unconcerned by her words, as if he'd dealt with beings far more intimidating than a fallen queen. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. Actually, I'm hoping you can help me out." "Help you?" She arched a brow. "With what exactly?" "Not to sound desperate, but I'm stuck here. And as much as I love the local ambiance, I'd prefer to leave before I, become a permanent part of the scenery." For a moment, the absurdity of the situation hit her. Here she was, the former queen of a vast empire, sitting on the remnants of her former glory, and a human had just landed to ask for her help. It was ridiculous. It was laughable. And yet there was something about his tone, something disarming in his casual indifference, that made her pause. "Fine," she said, throwing her hands up in mock exasperation. "I'll help you, but don't think for a second that I'll be doing it out of kindness. You're lucky I'm in a good mood." The human grinned, clearly relieved. "Great, I knew I was in the right place." He extended a hand, his smile widening. "Ethan, by the way." Leothra hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. The touch felt strange, foreign. She had not known such casual contact in years, not since before the betrayal. She locked eyes with him, her long ears flicking slightly as she spoke with quiet determination. "Leothra." And for the first time in a long while, the queen wondered if there might be more to life than this desolate planet after all. The fire crackled weakly, its orange glow casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. Leothra sat opposite Ethan, her posture stiff and regal despite the crumbled ruins surrounding them. She could feel the remnants of her old self, her former strength and dignity, rising like ghosts from the past. Yet there was a strange sort of peace in this new life. The silence was different now, not as oppressive, but still heavy with the weight of the world she no longer ruled. Ethan, for his part, appeared entirely at ease, as if sitting on the edge of a dying world was a perfectly normal evening for him. He tore into a rations packet with enthusiasm, the sound of tearing plastic filling the otherwise quiet night. Leothra's gaze flicked toward him. For a human, he didn't seem entirely foolish. She had expected to find him cowering or panicked, but instead he had set up a fire, unfazed by her reputation or the history she carried. "You know," Ethan said around a mouthful of food, "you'd think a queen would have better manners than to just sit there in silence while I do all the talking. It's a little awkward, don't you think?" Leothra narrowed her eyes at him. "I did not invite you to entertain me." "Fair point," Ethan replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "But come on. I'm stuck on a planet where the only other person around is a former queen who looks like she could eat me alive. You've got to admit, it's a little weird. And if I don't crack a joke or two, I'm going to lose it." Leothra's lips twitched, though she quickly masked it with a scowl. "You're lucky I haven't decided to let you rot here. I could, you know." "True," Ethan said, nodding seriously, "but I have a feeling you won't. You're too dignified for that." "Dignified?" she scoffed. "You haven't seen me when I'm not playing the part of some broken ruler." "Yeah, well," he said with a grin, "that's the thing, isn't it? You don't have to play the part anymore. The whole queen thing is done." Leothra stiffened, but before she could snap back, Ethan was already rifling through his gear, pulling out a small, glowing device. It emitted a soft hum as it powered up, and she couldn't help but watch him curiously. He clearly didn't mind breaking the tension, even when she wasn't particularly willing to cooperate. "What is that?" she asked, nodding toward the device. "This? Ethan grinned, clearly enjoying her interest. This is a personal communicator. My little ticket to freedom. Your ticket to freedom, she repeated, raising an eyebrow. And why should I care about your ticket? Because, Your Majesty, Ethan said, giving her a cheeky grin, we're going to need to call in a favor to get out of here. Unless, of course, you want to stay here indefinitely. She stared at him for a long moment, her patience wearing thin. You really think I'm in the business of making deals with humans? Well, that's why you're so charming, he said with a smirk, leaning back against a boulder. You always think about the big picture. But right now the big picture is, I need a ride off this rock. Leothra folded her arms across her chest. And you believe that I will simply help you? After all that has happened to me? Ethan shrugged, unbothered by her tone. I think you'll help me because you don't have much else to do. Plus, I've got a really good playlist on this communicator, and I've been told my taste in music is legendary. She stared at him, her mind racing. He was right, of course. She had nothing left to lose. No empire to rebuild, no war to wage. And yet, as much as she hated to admit it, there was something about this human's absurd optimism that irritated her. Yes, but also intrigued her. He was completely unfazed by her past, by her reputation, and for some reason that was disorienting. I am not your ticket to freedom, she said firmly. I am not some relic to be used when you find yourself in a tight spot. Ethan held up his hands again, a look of mock surrender on his face. All right, I get it. You're a powerful and proud queen, and I'm just some stranded human. But humor me for a second. How long were you planning to just sit here, waiting to die? Her breath caught at the bluntness of his question, and for a moment she was silent. How long? Days? Weeks? Time had blurred, but now that he mentioned it, the thought of simply waiting here to fade into nothing was unappealing. I don't know, she said quietly, her gaze shifting to the horizon. Maybe I wasn't planning anything. Maybe I had already given up. You know, Ethan said, his tone light but still laced with a hint of sincerity. I've met a lot of people who've given up, but you're not like them. You can't be. She was about to protest, but then she stopped herself. What if he was right? What if she was still capable of something more? The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows across her face, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to think about the possibility of change. You know, she said slowly, as though considering the words carefully, there is a place where I might be able to get us off this planet. Ethan looked up, his eyes lighting up with sudden hope. Now that's what I'm talking about. You really do have a plan, don't you? A plan, Leothra scoffed. Hardly. But I do know of a derelict transport ship not far from here. It's buried deep within the ruins of the colony. I could access the comms if it hasn't completely shut down by now. Ethan's grin widened, and he sprang to his feet, his enthusiasm nearly infectious. All right. Now that's what I call progress. Lead the way, Queen Leothra. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her armor, eyeing him with a mix of irritation and reluctant amusement. Do not get too excited, human. It may not work. I may not be able to get the ship to power up at all. He waved his hand dismissively. Hey, what's life without a little adventure? Plus, if we fail, at least we'll have the world's most dramatic campfire story to tell. Leothra couldn't help the flicker of amusement that danced in her chest. This human was impossible. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a small part of her that had not entirely given up. And with that, the two of them set off into the night. The soft hum of Ethan's communicator, the only sound breaking the stillness of Zaldrath's barren surface. The galaxy, it seemed, had more in store for them than either of them had expected. The ship's engines hummed to life with a groan, not quite as smooth as Leothra would have liked, but enough to give them a fighting chance. Ethan stood beside her, his eyes alight with excitement, his hands busy at the control panel. She couldn't quite recall when he had learned how to fly a ship, but then again, he had surprised her with every ridiculous talent he seemed to possess since their first encounter. This human had an uncanny knack for making the impossible seem effortless. All right, Ethan said, adjusting the comms dial, his voice muffled slightly through the helmet's mic. It's not the most polished ride in the galaxy, but it'll get us to the nearest spaceport. And then, Well, who knows? Leothra couldn't help but smile despite herself. You humans are so oddly optimistic. You'd probably find a way to turn this derelict heap into a luxury yacht if given enough time. He chuckled. I like to think of it as improvisation. Besides, we've made it this far, right? She gave a small nod, but inwardly she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She had left the wreckage of her empire behind. What remained of her pride, her former life. And while part of her relished the prospect of escape, of leaving this barren planet and its memories behind, there was still the question of what lay ahead. She couldn't simply disappear into the vastness of the galaxy again. Could she? The ship lurched, throwing her forward for a brief moment, but Ethan caught her arm in time. He smirked. You all right, Your Majesty? I don't need your concern, she said, steadying herself. It's just that your piloting needs refinement. He grinned, undeterred by her sharp tone. It's a work in progress. Besides, I'm just following the directions you gave me. Leothra turned back toward the control panel, tapping a few commands into the console. Well, let's hope your directions are better than your flying. This ship's not exactly designed for comfort, but it'll have to do. As the ship ascended from Zaldrath's atmosphere, the desolate surface slowly shrinking below them, Leothra felt something shift in her. For so long, she had existed in a state of survival, fighting for dominance, for control, for power. Even after her fall, she had clung to the idea that her legacy, her rule, was the only thing that defined her. But now in this tiny, unremarkable ship with a human who barely seemed fazed by the wreckage of her past, Leothra realized that maybe there was more to life than the cold ambitions she had once held so dearly. The ship broke through the last layer of atmosphere, and the stars stretched before them, infinite and impossibly beautiful. For the first time in a long while, Leothra felt the faintest stirrings of hope, something she hadn't dared to acknowledge in years. Ethan's voice broke into her thoughts. So, what now? I mean, we've got the whole galaxy out there to explore. No more hiding, no more running. What's next for you? The question hung in the air, and Leothra's lips parted, but no words came at first. What was next for her? Could she really leave the past behind? Could she really just live? She glanced at him. The human, ever so casual, was staring out the viewport with a grin, clearly relishing the simple thrill of flight. His optimism was as relentless as it was maddening. But it had worked. It had pulled her from the edge of despair and into something like possibility. I don't know, she finally admitted, her voice softer than she intended. I suppose I have to figure that out. Well, that's not so bad, he said with a shrug. Not everyone knows exactly what they're supposed to do next. Hell, I didn't think I'd end up stranded on a dead planet with a fallen queen. But here we are. Leothra couldn't help but let out a small laugh at that. It wasn't the most comforting thing to hear, but it was truthful, and for once it didn't sting. She'd come to understand that not everything needed to be planned down to the last detail. She wasn't the queen of the galaxy anymore. She didn't need to have it all figured out. Maybe that was the first real step toward freedom she had taken in years. As the ship cruised through the stars, Leothra leaned back in her seat, her fingers drumming absently on the armrest. Her mind drifted back to her time as queen, her reign, her battles, the betrayal that had brought her to this point. But instead of feeling the anger and resentment that had consumed her for so long, she felt a kind of release, a letting go. She wasn't defined by her past anymore. She didn't have to be. She could rebuild, if not an empire, then at least something that was truly hers. I'm glad I found you, she said quietly, her eyes focused on the stars outside. Ethan glanced over, his eyes crinkling with his signature grin. You know, I'm glad you didn't just let me die on that planet. I've had a lot of close calls in my life, but I have a feeling I wouldn't have made it without your help. Leothra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, considering the path they were on. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to control everything. She wasn't a queen anymore, not in the traditional sense, but there was still a chance, a glimmer of something more. Freedom, a life, a future perhaps. As the ship continued its journey through the stars, Leothra felt a smile tug at her lips. It wasn't the grand, all-consuming smile of a conqueror. It was simpler, smaller, more human perhaps. And for the first time in a long time, she realized that it was enough. "Thanks," she said almost sheepishly. "For everything." Ethan waved a hand. "Hey, you'd have done the same for me. Besides, I'm just here for the ride. And to provide the entertainment." He gave her a playful wink. "Someone's got to keep you from being too serious all the time." Leothra rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the smile that broke through. "You are insufferable. But you like me anyway." She turned away, trying to hide the small laugh that escaped her lips. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're not my type." "Oh, come on," he said, leaning back in his chair with an exaggerated sigh. "Don't pretend you haven't been thinking about it." Leothra smirked, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "You're delusional." Ethan chuckled, clearly undeterred. And for the first time in ages, Leothra felt that old familiar spark of laughter, of genuine joy. It wasn't the laugh of a queen, nor the laugh of a fallen ruler, but something else, something entirely her own. And as the stars stretched endlessly before them, she realized that this was only the beginning. Whatever came next, it would be hers to decide.